you aren't super familiar with whitebark pine, I just wanted to kind of give an overview of it. It's a high elevation species. It's not a commercial species. It's a really beautiful kind of fluffy tree you see in the subalpine 5-needle pine. And it grows all the way up to the very edge of tree line in certain areas, down into the subalpine forest. Usually on southwest aspects in acidic soils, but what Karen and I found was actually it doesn't. This is what it says in all the literature, that you only find it on southwest aspects, but what we found is it's everywhere. Mature trees can get pretty big, and it lives a really long time. The oldest recorded whitebark pine in Alberta was 1,100 years old. Wow. And it's considered to be a keystone species, so it has a role in the subalpine environment in recolonizing after a disturbance in that high elevation zone. And it's also a critical food source for Clark's nutcrackers. And in Alberta, it's currently designated as endangered. So just to give you an idea of the distribution, here's a really simple map showing where you find it. It's all along the Continental Divide, starting at Paco Island Park in the north, all the way along the mountains into Waterton in the south. And of course, it extends west into BC and south into the United States outside of Alberta. And the whole, just about the whole distribution of whitebark pine in Alberta falls within Grizzly Bear range. So here's the kind of places where whitebark pine grows. I'm scared to show Gord this picture because he knows what kind of summer Karen and I had for a couple of years there, suffering through the whitebark pine fieldwork. It's in really beautiful habitat. Again, that subalpine habitat, only on mountainsides, really spectacular kind of habitat. So when we're talking about whether or not bears are interested in this tree, we're worried about the cones. Whitebark pine doesn't start producing cones until pretty late, at least around 30 years old the trees are, and then they don't really produce a lot of cones till about 60 to 80 years old. And the cone crops are really variable from year to year. All conifers do this, but especially whitebark pine, they sort of have a peak cone production every 3 to 5 years, and in between there's almost no cones produced. And for regeneration, this species is almost totally dependent on the Clark's nutcrackers. And the Clark's nutcrackers are quite dependent on the whitebark pine. So probably a lot of you have seen Clark's nutcrackers before. They stash the seeds, so they'll stash 10 to 15 seeds just below the surface of the soil. It's a food cache for them, but they don't remember all of the food caches, or they don't come back to all of the food caches. So the ones that they don't return to, those seeds actually germinate. And that's basically the only way that whitebark pine seeds get dispersed. The seeds are quite a bit bigger than other conifer seeds, and they have a really high fat content. So what they actually look like when you take the seed coat off is they look like the pine nuts that you can buy in the store to make pesto or pastas with. And I brought some here if you guys want to check it out on your way out to look at the size of the seed. And so in terms of energy, they're a really high energy source. Less than meat, but quite a bit more than any other plants. So here's some cones in different stages of development. The one on the top left there is a new cone forming. So the cones take a 2-year cycle to mature. So if a cone is forming in the spring of 2012, it will be ready in the fall of 2014. There's Karen as the hand model in all these photos. But so the one on the top left is just forming. The ones in the middle are just about mature. Top right there that's a cache out of squirrel midden. And then these ones on the bottom, this is what you'll mostly see. It's such an important energy source for a lot of animals that it's really hard to find a mature cone when you're walking around out there. They just get eaten right away. So this one has been picked over by a nutcracker already, and all the seeds are gone. And so mostly what you see are these empty cones. The reason why we did this research in the first place was we got a request from Alberta Parks to look at a possible relationship between whitebark pine and grizzly bears. So Joyce Gould of Alberta Parks approached Gord with a little bit of funding, and that's based on a few things. So the status of whitebark pine, it's currently, as I mentioned, endangered, and that's because of blister rust and mountain pine beetle. But in the Wilmore, where we started our study, there's a relatively large, healthy population. So in southern Alberta, like in the Waterton area and places in the States, whitebark pine are just about obliterated by the blister rust and pine beetle, but in our study area, relatively speaking, they're quite healthy. And in previous locations, like in the Yellowstone, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, there's a really well-documented relationship between bears and whitebark pine. In other words, bears are known to use these seeds as a really important food source. But it had never been documented in our study area. And then just sort of the need to better understand the ecological significance of the species. So we started off in the Wilmore and then we expanded. So a lot of the previous research on bears and whitebark has been done in the States, mostly in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and then the eastern slopes in Montana. And it's well documented as a really important food source. So in years where they have a really good cone crop, a lot of bears will eat nothing else in the fall. But it's really seasonal. It's only when the cones are ready, and it's really variable from year to year because they don't produce a lot of cones every year. And what they found in the Yellowstone is that years of high cone crops, bears had more calories available to them. They stayed up higher because they didn't need to come down into the valley to look for food, and there were less human-bear conflicts. They also found that in the spring following a really good cone crop year for whitebark, females tended to have more cubs. So when we looked at what had been previously done sort of in Alberta, BC, or even within Canada, there wasn't a lot of previous research on whitebark. I think that it was sort of felt that we didn't have the same densities of whitebark here as in the States, and that it probably wasn't an important food source. So when we looked through all the studies, there's been a lot of work done, of course, on habitat and foods for bears in Alberta. But when we looked through even some of the older studies, it had never been reported as a major food source, but what we found was that a lot of the studies had never included whitebark pine distribution in their study area. So we weren't sure if it really wasn't an important food source or if it just really hadn't been looked at before. And we know that bears eat all kinds of foods. It depends on the season, the year, the location. So it was possible, even though it hadn't been previously reported, it was very possible that it still was an important food. So based on all of this, the relative abundance of whitebark in our area and the fact that it hadn't really been looked at before, it was possible that we could find a relationship. And whitebark and grizzly bears are both species at risk, so if there was an important relationship between the two, it could have implications for conservation. So we started out with some really basic research questions. Are whitebark pine seeds even available to bears? Are there enough trees in our area to make them available? And one question that we were sort of afraid of the answer for was this: do red squirrels even build middens in these whitebark stands? So in the States, the whitebark grow at a bit of a lower elevation, easier climate, friendlier habitat maybe for squirrels. So we weren't even sure if we were going to find any squirrel middens in these whitebark stands. And the way that bears in Yellowstone get almost all of their whitebark seeds is they dig up squirrel middens. So we were a little bit afraid that we were going to go out there and discover that squirrels don't even live in whitebark in Alberta, and that would have really been bad for me. Because this was my first project, one of my first projects with FRI, and our first field trip, I was a little worried that my summer job was about to end, because if we found that there weren't enough whitebark and there were no squirrels, then the rest of the study basically would carry on. But and then if there are squirrels and they are building middens, do they cache cones at these middens from whitebark trees or not? Maybe the squirrels aren't even caching the cones. So these were some really basic questions that we didn't know the answers to. And you can see that our second question really depends on the first. If whitebark seeds weren't even available to bears, you can figure out that bears aren't going to be eating them. So the second question was just looking at whether or not bears eat seeds. And then our third research question was trying to relate some kind of characteristics of the forest stand or species that were growing in those forests, or slope or aspect, or something that might help us predict which whitebark stands do bears use and which do they not use. So this is where we did our field work in 2008, 2009. All in the Wilmore in 2008, and then down into Jasper and Banff in the Siffler in 2009. So since we know that bears get all these seeds from squirrel middens, the methods become all about looking for squirrels, which is a little bit funny when you're working for the Grizzly Bear program to suddenly be obsessed with squirrels. Karen and I found even when I was walking around at home, whenever I heard a squirrel rattle, I became hypervigilant and looking for middens. So the whole purpose becomes finding these squirrel middens, because if there's no middens, there's no cones cached, there's no food for the bears. So I don't know if you can see the squirrel in that picture. This was from one of our remote sensing cameras.
A little bit to the right.
Yeah, he's right here. But I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but we set up some remote cameras at some middens, and we mostly got these sorts of pictures, unfortunately. So we did these transect surveys. Basically, we walked back and forth across the slopes looking for squirrel middens, taking some measurements of the trees, prism sweeps, and some other basic measurements of aspect and slope and all that kind of stuff. And then if we found a midden, we measured it. We decided if it was active or inactive. In other words, was the squirrel still living there? We looked to see if the squirrel was caching whitebark cones. And then we looked for bear activity. So we looked to see if the midden had been dug up. And we looked to see if there was scat nearby, if there was scat nearby. And then if there was scat, we collected it and brought it back just to confirm that if it had whitebark in it or not. And we set up a bunch of remote cameras at some of the middens to see if we could get pictures of the bears coming to the middens in the fall. That didn't work out very well, but I'll show you some photos of that. So, really wide variation of what the density of the trees were at different study sites, and a little bit less than what had been documented in the Yellowstone. So maybe lower availability of whitebark in our area than in the Yellowstone. So this is just to give you an idea of the different areas. So this is in the Wilmore on the left here, and there's a group of whitebark up there. And actually, I don't know if this is clear enough, but at the bottom, you might be able to see there's a whole bunch of trunks coming out of one spot. And so that would have been a nutcracker cache. So often when you see these trees, there's 5 or 10 trunks coming out of the same spot because more than one of those seeds germinated. And then another spot in the Wilmore there. So it was everything from these big trees, kind of closed forest, to this is in the Palisades area where there's only about 3 whitebark in this whole picture. So, we did find squirrel middens in these whitebark stands. That was exciting. And the number of middens per hectare was about the same as in other places. And we did find whitebark pine cones at these middens. So we were pretty happy to discover that. And it seemed like for our red squirrels, they just needed a lot of trees. So it didn't matter what percentage of what kind of trees, as long as there was a certain canopy cover. The squirrels, there were middens there. And that's probably because of that interannual change in cone production. So if there's only one kind of tree in an area, it's harder for a squirrel to make a loop. So we saw all kinds of middens as well, not just sort of your typical midden that you see around here with a big spruce tree in the middle. Sorry, this is really slow to change. Some of the higher elevation middens were actually really steep, like this one. There's Karen feeling very happy about being out of the office. This was really great field work for us. So this was a gigantic midden that we found near Geraldine, Mount Geraldine in Jasper. So all different kinds of middens in these whitebark stands. That's So what about the bears? So we found we went to 11 different spots, and in 6 of those we found evidence that bears were using whitebark. And we found diggings and scat at these places. So if we found that the midden had been dug up, we looked around for bear scat that had the whitebark pine seed casings in it, so that the seed coat, the outer coat, is practically the only part that doesn't get digested by the bear. So if we found that something had dug up the midden to be sure that it was a bear, we looked for the scat as well. Although at a lot of them it was pretty obvious that it was a bear because we couldn't think of anything else big enough to cause that kind of destruction. We would find, I'll show you some pictures, we would find huge clumps of dirt and clumps of midden displaced. And so all of the diggings and the scat looked old. We were there in 2008, 2009, and it was all from before that. That made sense to us because it had been a peak cone production year in 2007, so it made sense that the bears hadn't been there in the years after that. And we didn't get any pictures of bears on our remote cameras. So this is just to give you an idea of what a dug up midden looks like. You can see big clumps of dirt. So this is actually that big midden that I showed a picture of earlier, and it had just been completely ripped apart. And just go back to this one. We had someone coming out to help us that day, and she called it Middengeddon, because it was like the Armageddon of all middens, like the whole thing had just been ravaged. And I can't remember, I don't think we saw a squirrel at that midden. So after a midden has been dug up by a bear, sometimes squirrels leave, sometimes they rebuild it, and sometimes there's evidence that the bear actually eats the squirrel as well. So, or sometimes the squirrel may die because its whole cache has been dug up. We didn't end up counting how many cones the squirrels had cached at these middens because Karen and I both felt guilty digging up the middens, which Gord found really funny. We felt bad for the little squirrels. So all the tunnels and caches and little compartments that squirrels put their cones in, if it was a midden that a bear had dug up, these were all ripped apart. So you can see there's just big gaping holes in this midden. And it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's a picture of scat. So this is actually scat full of the whitebark pine seed coats. Mostly what we saw.
There's berry. Go back to that one.
There's berries in it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and there's two whitebark pine cones in the
Right.
picture. So this was a mixture, I think, of empetrum, of crowberry and whitebark. And then this one was just pure whitebark. So that we did see some like this that were in a log still, but a lot of them were washed out. So this was a scat that was 100% whitebark pine seed coats. And over time, it kind of falls apart and gets washed out. And so in theory, bears only dig up cones at middens, but people have reported that they'll climb trees to get them. So it's kind of that old thing when people tell you that bears can't climb trees. It's not true, of course, and there's been cases of a lot of scars on trees, you can see the nail marks on this one. This is a whitebark pine tree where bears presumably are trying to get at the cones. So we're a little disappointed with being able to predict where bears might dig up whitebark. The size of the midden, if it was a bigger midden, there was a better likelihood that the bear would dig it up, but that's pretty obvious because it would just be a bigger payload. So you could see why a bear would target a bigger midden instead of a smaller midden. And then in terms of everything else, like percent of different species or slope or aspect or anything else that we might be able to use to predict which whitebark stands bears would use, nothing predicted it. So this was sort of meant as a pilot study, and the conclusions are fairly simple, but the answers to our first 2 questions: yes, whitebark seeds are available to bears in our study area, and yes, bears were using them. No evidence that they were using them after 2007, so we did see that kind of year-to-year variation. And questionable role of of the stand characteristics, trying to predict whether or not bears would dig them up. But another question we really wanted to answer was how important is it? So we know that bears are using white bark, they're eating these seeds, but what's the role in their diet? Are they eating them occasionally? Do they eat a lot of it? We still hadn't answered that question, and I will talk about that a little bit more after. So what does it mean that they're eating whitebark pine? Bears are generalists, we know this. They'll eat just about anything, whatever's available, basically. So, you know, for peak production years of other bear foods like huckleberries, you know, we think probably they do better after those kinds of years. So it's conceivable that after a big year of this food source, there could be more cubs, or the bears would be in better condition. And that's something that we'd really like to find out today. So we're doing a pilot project right now. We sent some hair away, and we're doing a sulfur isotope study. So they analyze the ratio of different sulfur isotopes in the hair and in some of the bear foods, and from that they can estimate the relative proportions of different foods in that bear's diet. So over the course of the summer and fall, as the bear is eating, the signature of those isotopes is getting deposited in the hair. And we have some hair that we collected for a DNA study, and it was the year after a big whitebark pine year. So we've sent those away to look at whether we can estimate this from the hair. So what we're hoping is that it'll tell us sort of what percentage of that bear's diet was made up of whitebark pine and other foods as well. So that would really provide important information. You know, is it 1%? Is it 50%? The significance of this as a bear food really depends on how much of the diet is made up of this food. And whitebark populations are really, I mean, they're endangered and they're really under threat by the blister rust and the pine beetles. So if populations were to decline further in our study area, and it is an important food, you can see that it would have effects on bear populations. Yeah, so this was a project in cooperation with Alberta Parks and lots of in-kind contributions from Grizzly Bears program. And just for fun, I just wanted to run through some of the remote camera pictures that we got. So we were really excited. We went to these Middens and we set up the cameras, and we had grand hopes that we would come back a month later and we'd have these amazing pictures of bears digging up squirrel middens or walking by to check out the midden or something, right? Because we thought even if they're not digging it up, maybe they'll come and check it out every fall to see if there's anything there. So we set up 6 cameras, I think. We came back a month later, and most of them had 2 pictures on it. Some of them had more, like one had 50 pictures of a squirrel, I think. So there's a squirrel in this picture. So we mostly got this. A little bit of this. And
Huge squirrel.
yeah, squirrel. This one we circulated. Everybody had a different opinion on this. I think it's a porcupine, but nobody seemed to agree. But mostly what we got was this.
I can't believe you put that out.
So what do you mean? So whenever we set up the camera,
She being chased by a bear?
I was being
this is a live reenactment of a bear walking past the midden. So we would set the camera up on the midden, and the first one we set up, we have to make sure that we can trigger the camera where we think the bear is going to be. So I set up the camera, and then Karen said, "Okay, we need to test it," but sorry, I hope I'm not embarrassing you. But instead of just sort of walking in front of it, she, without saying anything, she just immediately reenacted the bear. So mostly what we got, we'd have 2 pictures on every camera. We'd have this, and we'd have this, which was me looking to see if the camera was still working.
Were there any middens that had been dug up in the interim?
No, so we started this in 2008, and we visited sites in 2008 and 2009. It's hard to age scap sometimes, as I'm sure you know, but as far as we could tell, there was no activity in 2008 or 2009. So everything had been from that last year or older. And you can see that one picture of the scat was totally dissolved and flattened out. So yeah, there wasn't any activity that we could see. Yep.
So you're talking about specialized bear that specialize on these white pine cones, right? Because the area that you're talking about, there isn't a lot of grizzly bears in each different area, right? Because that's one bear's area or two or three.
In the Wilmore, there would be like...
How many would be overlapping? Like you've done your study, you know.
The density in the Wilmore is... What's the density of bears in the Wilmore?
Some of the highest in Alberta. I'd say the highest 18 bears per 1,000 square kilometers. So we've got a few bears overlap.
Yeah, so in that particular area, like especially in the Wilmore, a lot of those home ranges would overlap Whitebark pine distribution. I don't know how many or how many square kilometers, but definitely more than one bear would be overlapping.
And another question is that, okay, you've got grizzlies that are keying on it. So obviously black bears would, or even say a wolverine would key on that too.
Yeah, and so we thought about that, like black bear for sure, and that's been reported elsewhere. Based on sort of the elevation of a lot of this stuff, less likely, but possible. And we actually were going to send some DNA away.
Wolverine, definitely in that area you're talking about.
You know, we thought about Wolverine, but if you saw these middens, there's no way. Like, a Wolverine couldn't lift a clump of dirt this big. Like, it's the size of the destruction and the scat. Like,
The scat,
it wasn't Wolverine scat.
Right.
Unless it's a giant Wolverine. But when we first started looking at the diggings, we were sort of uncertain because we were learning as we went along too, and we thought, can we be sure that this was a bear? And then when we started to look at what had happened at that midden, I mean, either it was a bear or it was a guy with a shovel. Like, it was nothing else that we know of can dig like that.
Right.
And the only scat that was there was,
The only
that's the
scat that
evidence
was there
of
was
the
bear
scat,
scat.
right,
Yeah.
I mean, it could have been black bear scat.
It could have been black bear scat, and I know in
Oh, you guys did DNA the scat?
Well, we have some.
Or you have some?
Yeah. In Banff, I know they found some black bears and grizzly bears were using it. So
Both, yeah.
yeah.
So there must be a hormone or a scent that comes off those cones as they're ripening, just like wine would be or fruit or whatever, right? At a certain time.
This is the thing that I found really interesting. So presumably, it looked like there were some middens that had been dug year after year, and we could kind of guess that by the old destruction was revegetated. You could see the newer destruction, so it looked like there were middens that had been dug more than once. So
That poor squirrel.
I know. Well, they let you tell it. They tell you how they feel about it when you're there.
Oh.
So if a bear is returning to that same midden year after year, it's within that bear's feeding pattern, right? Like same as they would return to berry areas year after year. So that's why we were hoping we would catch them on camera, even if it was a bad cone year. So we don't know, how did the bears know, like were they counting cones on whitebark pine trees? Like how did they know there weren't going to be any cones there?
There's got to be scent when they ripen.
They must, so like they didn't even do a walk by, or we would have probably got that on some of the cameras.
But how much was in that midden?
None.
So
because
there's
there were
no
cones.
value there at all. They're not coming back.
But we thought
You
that
have to find one that's green or whatever, and then sit your cameras there as it ripens. They're coming.
yeah, I mean, we thought they would have at least traveled through looking, but they didn't. So, yeah.
Is there any effort being made to breed blister rust resistant white bark like
Yeah.
they do with white pine?
Yeah, and they're using those for regeneration in a bunch of places. I think in Waterton, and I think places in the States. Do you remember Karen? Joyce Gould was talking about that. So yeah, they've been growing them in nurseries. They've been selecting cones. They actually have these special things they use to catch the cones from blister-resistant trees. So they'll go out and do a health transact, and if it's a tree that isn't showing signs of blister rust while the next tree is, yeah, they'll collect those cones and grow them in the nursery.
One of the cool things about this whole whitebark pine thing was the bears don't eat the cones. They're able to use their tongue and pull out each seed.
Yeah, and that was, they actually observed them doing that in I think it was maybe, what's his name? Pardon me?
It's Yellowstone.
Yeah,
Dave
so
Middens.
captive bears, black bears and grizzly bears, they watched them eat the cone. And so I actually, if you want to have a look on your way out, so they would pull the cone scales off the cone and then pull the seed out, and they would eat the seed with the seed coat on it. So then all you find in the scat is that seed coat. You don't find a single cone scale or bit of cone in that scat. They just somehow.
So they got nutcrackers too? and
Yeah.
everything? Picks, eh?
That's what they
Yeah.
mean.
Sorry, you had a question?
It seems that the amount of squirrel middens would depend on the population of squirrels. Were you assuming like, or were you tracking squirrel populations? Because that would be an indicator of the amount and quantity of midden.
Yeah, so we were basing this on, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of assumptions, right? That it,
But
you
you're
mean that
just
it's
assuming a constant of.
that it's a healthy squirrel population is
Okay.
what, and there are years where there's a cone crop failure of a bunch and the population plummets. So we didn't do anything with actual squirrel populations. What we did document was whether or not a midden was occupied, so if it was active or inactive. And most of our middens were occupied or active, occupied by squirrels. But yeah, you're right. Like so whether or not an area has a healthy squirrel population will determine the middens. But a lot of these middens have been there for.
And they have
Tens
huge
and tens.
ranges of from totally decomposed to fresh.
Yeah,
So,
and so we.
so that the bear, what you were finding, where the bears were finding the fresh cones and chewing them like corn on the cob and picking the nuts out of those, like a squirrel gets the food out of the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
kind of feeding pattern a bear would use as a squirrel uses to get the seeds out of them.
Well, I don't know.
They get them out somehow.
They get-
I don't
yeah.
know if they I don't know if they do it like the squirrel or
It's
not.
really hard to imagine how they could pick that cone apart, but.
Well, they have the claws to do it, so.
Yeah. So, yeah, we would find, I mean, we were there years after, so we're, it's a little bit harder to figure out, but we wouldn't find any evidence of cone in the scat, just.
It would seem to me like a lot of energy to get a little bit of food.
Yeah.
And so that it wouldn't be really, like, why
Yeah.
would you waste your time trying to
Well,
separate the wheat
yeah.
from the chaff when there's lots of fresh
The
vegetation
thing
around
is,
the
it's a
berries?
really, really high quality food source. So, like, I don't know if you've ever bought pine nuts at the store and read the nutritional value. It's like fat and protein, and that's it. And the middens are this concentrated cache of them. So the bears aren't. I could see if they had to pick their own cones, it wouldn't be worth their effort. But the squirrel has spent 2 months caching them for the bear. And then the bear just comes along and probably in a good year, hundreds and hundreds of cones all in one spot. So, I mean, we like to reenact what we think happened. So we picture like the bear comes and you could tell it would eat and crap and eat and crap. And like it probably hung out there for a day or something and just ate till they were gone. Lots of places we would find multiple piles of scat so that it looked like the bear had been there a while. So maybe it stayed till they were all gone, and because they were all basically nicely piled up for him to eat.
So did you also look for like white spruce or pine or other kinds of seeds in the scat?
Yeah. You know what? In the Whitebark
scat?
Pine scat, I'll show you actually.
You can't see that. That's
Yeah.
the isotope work would.
Yeah, so this is sort of typical of what the scat would look like. So we would take the scat sample and bring it back and spread it all out. And mostly we would find,
And the other seeds out
Almost
there, I
only
don't
that.
think they eat that. They like spruce seeds and like regular lodgepole pine. They're just tiny little things compared to.
yeah, there's such a difference in the size of the seed. Does anybody else have a question?
What do you say was the dispersal mechanism?
Of whitebark?
Yeah,
Clark's nutcrackers.
they're a songbird?
I
That's
wouldn't call
open to
them a song, but-
interpretation. They sound like this.
Is- I'm just wondering if
They're
that's
a
any
J,
kind of-
aren't they?
Yeah,
if that's
Aren't
a
they?
factor.
Yeah.
Corvids, yeah.
They're Corbin.
yeah. If that's a what,
So
sorry?
like, I mean, if, for example, the population of ducks and nutcrackers crashed for some reason, that would also be a factor.
It
right?
could, but probably the only way, from what they're seeing in Waterton and other places, the reason the population of Clark's nutcrackers is crashing is because the whitebark is crashing.
Okay.
Because they've had this symbiotic relationship for however, hundreds or thousands of years.
So global warming will change that distribution.
And probably same with the blister rust and the pine beetle. But the only fire can sometimes distribute the whitebark seeds, but fire isn't, I don't know, they're almost totally dependent on the nutcrackers. And fire isn't as common in the areas where whitebark is found. So the theory is that they're like 99% reliant on Clark's nutcrackers for regeneration. Yeah.
No squirrels were harmed in this. I'm just kidding.
No
I made sure of it.
Karen was almost harmed by a squirrel at 1 minute. I thought it was gonna, I don't know, bite her face or something. The whole time we were measuring the minute and collecting all our stuff, it was but yeah, no squirrels were harmed.
So then the greater threat, is it the pine beetle or blister rust?
It depends where. In our area, it's
Like
the
Wilmore.
blister rust.
Okay.
Yeah. I think some places have been hit by both. The Wilmores has blister rust, but it has less than a lot of other whitebark pine areas. Like Waterton was almost totally wiped out by the blister rust. Yeah.
They've got some pheromone traps out around the main whitebark pine stands in the Wilmore to try to get the pine beetle to
Focus
skip
on
them.
that, yeah.
So when's the next big year for the cones? Is it a 4-year or 5-year?
Well, that's the weird
we're
thing. Yeah, so it's on supposedly it's every 3 to 5 years. The last big year was 2007. But you can tell almost 2 years in advance if it's going to be a big year or not. And 2012, I don't think 2012 is going to be a big year. Last year was a medium year. We saw some, but like in a big year, it would be hundreds and hundreds of cones per tree. So I don't think this year is going to be it either. So we'll see. And it tends to be a widespread event, like a massed year in one stand. It'll be a massed year like everywhere in the Wilmore kind of thing, but maybe not everywhere in southern Alberta. And who knows why? Not me. Any other questions?
Does the seed have to leave, fall out of the cone before it can grow? Say if a squirrel buried a cone.
I think the reason why the Clark's nutcrackers caches are so successful is that they actually bury them in the soil. In a squirrel midden, I don't know that it could germinate. And basically, the squirrel is called a predator on whitebark pine, which is kind of a funny way, but when squirrels eat whitebark, they call it cone predation. The squirrel is seen as a dead end for whitebark. Either they eat them all or they're all in the midden and they don't get a chance to germinate. Yeah. And same with chipmunks will eat them too. So the only species that eats them but actually lets them germinate are the nutcrackers.
So those clusters of trees you were showing were probably coming from Clark's.
Yeah, so like the nutcracker would cache 10, 15 seeds, and some of those would germinate. So you often see them in these, it looks like one tree with lots of trunks, but they're genetically distinct trees. Like each is a separate tree, but they all grow out of the same spot.
So that'd be a nuthatcher with Alzheimer?
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that.
It happened.
Yeah. Yeah, whether they don't remember it's there or whether they just don't need it.
Because they say that a raven or whatever can, or a whiskey jack can remember 500 spots
Yeah.
for 2 years or whatever.
So maybe they had 520 spots, I don't know.
There you go.
Yeah. Any other questions?
If not, I'd like to thank Tracy for